Ladies and gentlemen, after enough years in late-night television, you start believing you've seen just about everything. You think you've survived every technical problem, every surprise guest, every joke that lands, and every joke that doesn't. You get comfortable, maybe a little too comfortable. Then one ordinary Tuesday evening comes along and reminds you that live television has a wonderful habit of doing exactly what it's not supposed to do. Now picture it with me, December 15th, 1982. The Tonight Show is moving along exactly the way everyone hoped it would. We've got about 300 people packed into the studio, laughing in all the right places. Out there across America, roughly 25 million viewers have settled into their living rooms, probably with a cup of coffee or maybe something a little stronger, ready for another evening together. I'm standing behind the desk talking about President Reagan's economic policies, taking a few friendly swings at the holiday shopping season, and generally trying to convince everyone that buying Christmas presents isn't nearly as painful as looking at the bill afterward. Everything is running like clockwork. The audience laughs. Ed McMahon is right where he's supposed to be. Doc Severinsen and the band are keeping everything moving. The timing feels perfect. Then, halfway through a joke about Christmas shopping, something happens that nobody, not the audience, not the crew, not even the people running the show, could have imagined. The bright red telephone sitting on my desk suddenly rings. Not once, not by accident. It keeps ringing. Now, if you've ever watched the show, you know that phone. It had been sitting there for years. We used it as part of a running joke, a little presidential hotline gag during monologues. It looked official enough to get a laugh, but there was one important detail. It wasn't connected to anything. It was a prop, a decoration, about as useful as a chocolate hammer, yet somehow, there it was, ringing. The sound cuts right through the middle of my punchline. The audience instantly goes quiet. Ed gives me a look that says, "Did you plan this?" I look back at him with a face that says, "If I had, I'd probably know what's happening." Doc and the band stop playing. For just a second, the whole studio freezes. And I'll admit it, I simply stare at the phone. You know those moments where your brain is trying to catch up with your eyes? That was one of them, because the impossible was happening. A disconnected telephone was ringing during a live national broadcast. I glance over toward Fred DeCordova. Poor Fred is behind the cameras waving his hands around like he's directing airplanes instead of television. He's every bit as confused as the rest of us. No one scripted this. No one rehearsed it. Nobody called a production meeting and said, "You know what would really spice up Tuesday night? Let's make the fake phone ring." It just keeps ringing. Finally, I figure, well, if a phone insists on interrupting national television, maybe the polite thing to do is answer it. So I reach over, pick up the receiver, and as calmly as I can manage, I say, "Hello, this is The Tonight Show." For just a moment, there's silence. Then a familiar voice comes through the speaker. Not just for me, for everyone, every person in that studio, every viewer watching at home. The voice says, "Johnny, is that really you? Now I'll tell you something. There are voices you recognize instantly, no matter how many years pass." That was one of them. My expression must have changed 3 or 4 times in about 2 seconds. Confusion, recognition, then complete disbelief. Because the person calling was my 78-year-old mother, Dorothy Carson, speaking from her home in Norfolk, Nebraska. I couldn't believe it. "Mom?" That's all I managed to say at first. "Mom, what are you doing calling the show? How in the world did you get through to this phone?" She laughs. Not nervous, not embarrassed, just the comfortable laugh of someone who has known you since before you learned how to tie your shoes. "Well, Johnny," she says, "I called NBC and told them it was an emergency. They connected me to some phone they said would reach you directly. I didn't know I'd be talking to you on live television until I heard everybody laughing." Well, by now the audience isn't laughing anymore. They're whispering, looking at each other, trying to figure out whether they're witnessing the greatest comedy bit we've ever produced or something completely real. And the truth? So was I. I run a hand through my hair and say, "Mom, you can't just call NBC and ask to be connected to The Tonight Show. That's not usually how these things work." She doesn't miss a beat. "Oh, honey," she says, "don't concern yourself with how it works. I told them I was your mother, and I had something important to tell you that couldn't wait until tomorrow." Only a mother can say something like that and somehow make it sound perfectly reasonable. Now, at this point, I have choices. I could apologize, go to commercial, pretend it's some elaborate practical joke. Try to steer us back toward the monologue. Instead, I decide to trust the moment. I lean back in my chair, smile, not the television smile, but the kind that sneaks up on you when someone you love catches you completely off guard, and I say, "All right, Mom, you've got about 25 million people listening now. What did you want to tell me?" And that's when the conversation changes. Not just for me, for everybody watching. She says, "Johnny, your father and I watched the show last week when you talked about growing up in Nebraska." I nod. "I wanted you to know how proud we are of you." Now, naturally, I smile, because she'd told me that before. "Mama," I say, "you tell me that all the time." "I know I do," she answers. "But tonight I wanted to tell you on television." That catches me completely off guard. She continues, "I wanted everyone watching to know what kind of son you are. Not the entertainer, not the television personality, not the fellow sitting behind the desk making jokes every evening." She says, "I want them to know Johnny Carson the person." Well, I'm getting uncomfortable now. The audience can probably see it. I've spent years making sure the spotlight stays on the comedy, never on me. So I tell her, "Mom, America doesn't need to hear about my personal life." She answers with the kind of certainty only mothers possess. "I think they do." Then she explains why. "You make people laugh every night, Johnny. But you never tell anyone about the things you do when the cameras aren't rolling." Now I'm thinking, uh-oh. Because mothers remember everything. And unlike lawyers, they don't need notes. She starts telling stories. Stories I'd never spoken about publicly. She reminds everyone that I'd quietly donated money to children's hospitals without putting my name on anything. She talks about helping comedians who were struggling, making sure they got support when they needed it. She mentions visits I'd made to veterans facilities, asking every single time that nobody invite reporters or photographers. Then she brings up something I'd completely forgotten anyone else even knew. She says, "Last month you flew home to Nebraska just to surprise Mrs. Henderson after her husband passed away. I immediately know where this is headed. You sat in her kitchen for 2 hours drinking coffee while she talked about Harold." Then she laughs softly. "She didn't even know you were famous. She only remembered you as the nice little boy who used to live next door." I could feel my face getting warm. There are moments when standing in front of 25 million people feels easier than hearing your mother compliment you. This was one of those moments. Quietly, I say, "Mom, people really don't need to know that." She keeps going anyway. And when little Tommy Patterson became sick, my heart sinks. I know exactly what she's talking about. "You paid for his medical treatments, but you told the family the money came from an anonymous donor." She pauses. "Tommy's mother called me crying because she wanted to thank whoever helped them." Another pause. I had to bite my tongue so I wouldn't tell her it was my son. By now, the studio is completely silent. Nobody's shifting in their seats. Nobody's whispering. No one is waiting for a punchline, because everyone realizes there isn't one. This isn't entertainment anymore. It's simply a mother telling the truth about her son. And sitting there behind that desk, I find myself asking quietly, "Mom, why are you telling everyone this now?" She doesn't answer immediately. When she finally speaks again, her voice is softer, gentler, different somehow. And the entire room seems to lean in. "Because, Johnny, I'm 78 years old, and I went to the doctor last week. They told me some things I need to think about." The audience, you could almost feel it, had changed. Folks had come in expecting jokes about Hollywood, Christmas shopping, politics, maybe a story or two about actors who couldn't remember their own lines. Instead, they found themselves listening to something much quieter. Sometimes television surprises you that way. Sometimes the loudest moment in a room is when nobody says anything at all. I looked over at the audience and said, "You know, it's funny. We spend years practicing how to make strangers laugh, but nobody ever teaches us how to sit with someone who's telling the truth." That earned a few knowing smiles. "I'll tell you something," I continued. "If you've ever hosted a television show, there's always somebody talking in your ear. Producers, directors, stage managers, everybody has an opinion. Move on. Hit the commercial. We're running long, but every once in a while, common sense tells you to ignore all of it. The audience applauded softly. Because every now and then, I said, real life decides it's more interesting than the script. I picked up the red phone resting on the desk and looked at it for a second before setting it back down. Now, this thing wasn't supposed to ring. As far as any of us knew, it couldn't ring. It had spent years sitting there pretending to be important, kind of like a few politicians I've met. The audience laughed. But that night, I paused. That night it rang anyway. When I answered it, I expected anything except the voice I heard. Johnny, is that really you? You know something. No matter how old you get, your mother's voice can still make you feel 12 years old. I smiled at the memory. Mom? The audience laughed gently. She sounded perfectly calm. Not a hint of panic. Not a hint that she'd accidentally interrupted a live television broadcast being watched by millions of people. To her, she wasn't calling NBC. She was calling her son. And mothers have never been terribly impressed by television. She explained she'd called the network, told them it was important, and somehow found herself connected straight into the studio. I remember thinking, only my mother could accidentally outsmart the NBC switchboard. That brought another laugh. Then I asked the obvious question. So, Mom, what couldn't wait until tomorrow? She didn't hesitate. Your father and I watched your show last week. Now I knew exactly where this was headed. Every son knows that sentence. Sometimes it ends with praise, sometimes it ends with advice. Usually it ends with both. She told me they were proud, not of the ratings, not of the awards, not of any magazine cover or newspaper headline, just proud. Funny how a single word from your mother can outweigh 1,000 compliments from strangers. I thanked her. I figured that would be the end of it. Instead, she surprised me again. No, Johnny, she said. I want everyone listening to know the kind of man you are. Now I started getting nervous. There are some stories you don't mind people hearing. There are others you quietly hope your mother forgets. Unfortunately, mothers possess remarkable memories, especially when you're hoping they don't. The audience laughed knowingly. She started telling everyone about little things I'd never talked about publicly. Visits I'd made without cameras, people I'd tried to help quietly, neighbors back home, old friends, folks I'd simply wanted to spend time with because they needed company more than publicity. Every time she mentioned one, I'd interrupt. Mom! She'd keep going. Mom! Still going. I finally realized I wasn't winning this conversation. Nobody wins an argument with a mother who's convinced she's right. That's a law of nature. Scientists could probably prove it. The audience laughed again. But after a while, the laughter faded because something in her voice changed. You know that moment when you hear someone you love speaking just a little more slowly than usual? Not dramatically, just enough to make your heart pay attention. She told me she'd been to the doctor. Now every parent tells you not to worry, usually right before giving you a reason to worry. She said she'd learned some things. The kind of things that make a mother think about time. The kind of things that remind you life isn't endless. Suddenly, I wasn't sitting behind a television desk anymore. I was just somebody's son. That's all. Nothing else mattered. Not cameras, not ratings, not commercials, not the monologue, certainly not the jokes. Just that voice coming through a telephone line stretching all the way from Nebraska. I asked quietly, Mom, are you sick? She didn't answer the question immediately. Instead, she said something I'll never forget. I'm trying to tell you, I love you. The room was completely silent. She reminded me of puppet shows I'd put on as a little boy whenever she'd had a difficult day. I'd forgotten all about those. Parents never forget those things. Children usually do. Funny arrangement. Parents remember the moments children outgrow. Children remember the rules. Parents remember the love. I could hear people crying in the audience. Truthfully, I wasn't doing much better. Television has a funny rule. You're supposed to stay composed. Smile. Keep things moving. Professionals don't fall apart. Turns out professionals are people first. I finally managed to tell her I loved her too. I promised I'd come home. We'd sit together, drink coffee, talk about everything. No cameras, no audience, just family. She liked that idea. Then, because she was still my mother, she reminded me I had a television show to finish. Imagine that. Millions of viewers waiting. Her concern? They came to see you make people laugh. Even then, she was thinking about everyone else. That's mothers for you. They'll interrupt a national broadcast and apologize for taking up your time. I finally turned back toward the audience. There wasn't much left to say. How do you follow a conversation like that? Certainly not with a joke about holiday shopping. I looked around the studio. People weren't staring at a celebrity anymore. They were looking at another human being. And maybe that's what television ought to do once in a while. Remind us we're all a lot more alike than we pretend. I told everyone something very simple. If your mother's still around, I stopped for a second. Call her. Not next month. Not when work slows down. Not after the holidays. Tomorrow, maybe tonight. Tell her what she means to you while she can still hear it, because none of us knows how many conversations we've got left. The applause that followed wasn't loud. It wasn't the kind that follows a punchline. It was quieter than that, more thoughtful. People weren't applauding a television moment. They were applauding something they'd recognized inside their own lives. And I remember thinking, sometimes the most memorable thing that happens on television isn't something anyone planned. It's simply life showing up without asking permission. As we finally headed toward commercial, I glanced one more time at that little red telephone. It looked exactly the same as it always had. Same color, same cord, same place on the desk. Yet somehow it had become something completely different. It wasn't a prop anymore. It was proof that no matter how carefully we write a show, no matter how perfectly we rehearse every cue, the moments people remember most are often the ones nobody could have written. And I had a feeling, even before the lights dimmed, that people wouldn't remember what joke I'd been telling before the phone rang. They'd remember the voice on the other end, a mother calling her son. Not because he was famous, not because he was America's favorite late-night host, but simply because, to her, he was still Johnny. The funny thing about a live television show is that once the cameras stop rolling, the audience goes home thinking the story is over. Believe me, that's usually when the real story begins. The next morning, I picked up the telephone before I'd even finished my first cup of coffee. There was only one call I wanted to make. When she answered, she sounded exactly like she had the night before. Calm, cheerful, completely unaware that she'd turned an ordinary television program into something millions of people would remember for years. Good morning, sweetheart. No dramatic introduction, no mention of the broadcast. Just good morning, I laughed. Mom, do you have any idea what happened last night? I hope I didn't embarrass you, she said. Now, that's a mother for you. She interrupts a national television broadcast watched by millions of people, and her biggest concern is whether her son might have felt a little awkward. I told her she hadn't embarrassed me. Quite the opposite. I'd spent years trying to create memorable television, and somehow she'd managed to do it without a script, a rehearsal, or even realizing she was on the air. She became quiet for a moment. Then she said something beautifully simple. I just wanted you to know how proud I am. Sometimes we spend our lives chasing applause from strangers when the words we've needed most were waiting for us at home all along. After we hung up, the reaction started arriving from every direction. Letters, phone calls, messages from people I'd never met. They weren't writing about comedy. They weren't asking about celebrities. They were telling stories. One person wrote that they called their mother after watching the show, even though they hadn't spoken in months. Another said they finally thanked their father for everything he'd done without expecting recognition. Families who had been putting off difficult conversations decided they couldn't afford to wait any longer. That surprised me. You spend enough years in entertainment, and you start believing people only remember the punchlines. Turns out they remember honesty a whole lot longer. Back at the studio, everyone was still talking about the broadcast. The crew kept asking whether any of it had been planned. I kept giving the same answer. If I'd planned it, it wouldn't have sounded nearly that real. There's something wonderfully unpredictable about life. It refuses to follow cue cards. It ignores commercial breaks. It doesn't care what page the script is on. Life simply walks onto the stage whenever it feels like it. Over the next months, I found myself making more trips home than I had before. Not because anyone reminded me, not because I felt guilty, because suddenly I understood something I'd been too busy to notice. Time isn't measured by calendars. It's measured by conversations, by shared meals, by cups of coffee that somehow last 3 hours, by stories you've heard 20 times but still smile through because the person telling them enjoys remembering. Whenever I visited, we'd sit together exactly as we'd promised. Coffee on the table, the familiar kitchen, no audience, no cameras, just family. Sometimes we'd laugh about the phone call. I'd tease her. You know, most mothers send birthday cards, she'd smile. I figured national television was faster. That always made me laugh. She never seemed especially impressed by show business. To her, Hollywood was simply the place where her son happened to work. Home was still Nebraska. Home was still where people knew your name before anyone recognized your face. As time passed, I also kept another promise. Whenever I traveled back, I'd stop and visit neighbors and old friends, the people my mother always asked about before asking about ratings. She had a remarkable way of measuring success. It wasn't by trophies. It wasn't by headlines. It was by whether people were kind. Eventually, the day came that every son hopes stays far away. When my mother passed away, the world expected me to return to work immediately. Instead, I took time away, not because I had forgotten how to do television, because some moments deserve silence before they deserve words. When I finally walked back onto that familiar stage, everything looked exactly the way I'd left it. The desk, the curtain, the lights, the audience waiting patiently, but one chair was missing. At least it felt that way. I talked about my mother, not as the woman who accidentally interrupted a broadcast, not as a memorable television story, simply as the person who taught me what mattered. She taught me laughter could brighten someone's evening. Kindness could brighten someone's life. Those aren't exactly the same thing. If you're lucky, you learn to do both. One object on the set changed forever after that night, the red telephone. For years, it had been a comedy prop, a harmless joke. After that unexpected call, it wasn't funny anymore. Not because anything sad had happened, because it had become something meaningful. Eventually, it found a quieter place away from the spotlight. Every time I looked at it, I remembered that extraordinary evening when a mother reminded her son and millions of strangers that affection should never be postponed. People occasionally asked me about the greatest moment I'd ever experienced on television. They expected stories about famous actors, historic interviews, presidents, championship athletes, wonderful memories, all of them. But my answer rarely changed. The greatest moment wasn't carefully produced. It wasn't rehearsed. It wasn't even supposed to happen. It arrived with the sound of a ringing telephone. Looking back now, that's probably the lesson. Television can entertain us, movies can inspire us, comedy can help us through difficult days. But every once in a while, life quietly steps in and reminds us that behind every public face is an ordinary human being who still needs encouragement from the people they love. Fame has a funny way of convincing the world someone has everything. Family reminds you what actually matters. Success may earn applause. Love earns peace. And if there's one thing that Unexpected Evening proved, it's that the conversations we keep postponing are often the ones we'll treasure the most once they're finally spoken. So if this story leaves you with anything at all, let it be this. Don't assume people know how much they matter. Tell them. Don't wait for the perfect holiday. Don't wait for retirement. Don't wait until life interrupts your plans. Pick up the phone, knock on the door, sit down over a cup of coffee, share a laugh. Say the words while there's still someone there to hear them, because the most unforgettable moments rarely happen when everything goes according to plan. They happen when real life quietly walks on stage, takes the spotlight for a few minutes, and reminds us that no performance, no matter how polished, will ever be as meaningful as a simple conversation spoken from the heart. And if you're fortunate enough to receive one of those calls that changes everything, answer it.